slogan is Lviv open to the world. Still this year, the openness of Lviv faced a huge challenge when Ryanair entry to our city has failed. But during the last years, two other events have happened which can justify Lviv's slogan much more than any local flights from Lviv airport. First of all, the publication of the East-West Street book by Philip Sands has opened Lviv and its history to minds of thousands of people around the world. They have gained the opportunity to take a deep and interesting journey to the past of this city and the past of international law. This journey, in spite of being hard and somehow provocative, provides a chance to understand through the personal stories of Herschel Uterpacht, Raphael Lemkin, Leon Buchholz, and the tragedy of Holocaust, how a couple of men with a strong will and belief can change the world and the surface of all international legal system. Besides opening minds of people in many countries to Lviv, the book of Professor Sands helps us here in Ukraine to open our minds to horrible events which have taken place in this city during the World War II and see it under a different angle, which is not traditionally recognized in Ukraine. But such a vision sometimes is hard to accept, but it's much needed to hold discussions in order to hear and to be heard. And Philip's book is a perfect trigger for such discussions. The second thing, which in the long run can also mean even more than Ryanair entry to Ukraine, is the opening of UCU Sheptytsky Center, where today we're very glad to host this event. This place, which sometimes in Lviv is called a spaceship, is designed to become a public center where on the crossroads of different spheres, new opportunities will be opened to the city and will be opening the city to the world. The figure of Metropolitan Sheptytsky is also very symbolic. In the light of the plot of East-West Street, he lived in hard times, but has made a lot of efforts to save Jewish children from extermination. And these efforts were recognized by awarding to him Courage to Care Award by Anti-Defamation League in 2013, which is named after another famous alumni of Lviv's University Law School, Jan Karski. This book, East-West Street, and the events which will take place in Lviv in the next days are marking a success of the long project, which was started by Professor Sands 7 years ago. This project is a long, complicated, but always inspiring due to Philip's energy and noble goals which are set up. I'm always saying that participation in this project means for me personally much more even than my PhD degree obtained in Ukraine. And to cooperation with Professor Sands, I owe my level of English, which is still far from being perfect, but is definitely much more better than in October 2011. In the end, I want to express a hope that today we are marking only one of the successful stages of this project, and in future new opportunities as well as challenges still are waiting for us. By this, I want to pass a word to Professor of the University College London, member of Matrix Chambers, author of East-West Street, and, what is the most important, the best friend of Lviv, Philip Sands.
That's now on. He does everything. Ivan, but for Ivan, we would not be here today. But there are so many people here today who have helped and make this possible. I'm not even going to begin to thank because there are too many people. But let me just say the Ukrainian Catholic University, the Ivan Franko University, the Center for Urban History, and a whole raft of individuals who welcomed me when I first set foot in this incredible city in 2010, made it possible as a sort of collegial exercise. It's incredibly meaningful to be here. It's an incredibly significant few days that we have ahead of us, and it's particularly meaningful to me that in the audience today we have members both of the Lauterpacht and Lemkin families, and it is, I think, we believe, the first time ever that the Lemkins and the Lauterpachts have met, which seems an extraordinary thing, but how fitting that it should happen in Lviv in 2017, about 100 years after they lived here. That is an extraordinary thing. So let me turn to what it is I'm going to talk about. I began to write East-West Street late in 2010, after I first visited this city. I travelled in response, as many of you know, to an invitation to deliver a lecture on my work as an academic and as a barrister on the law and the cases of mass killing. The work touched on genocide, which is about the protection of groups, and crimes against humanity, which is concerned with the protection of individuals. I accepted the invitation because I hoped to find the house where my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born in 1904. I wanted to understand the recesses of an unspoken family history and recover both my hinterland and a sense of identity. I found, as many of you who are new to this city will now be realizing, a truly extraordinary place, and also my grandfather's house, which by amazing and wonderful coincidence is at number 12 Szeptycki Street. These things somehow come together very nicely. The Polish poet and writer Joseph Witlin describes the essence of this city and of being a Lwovian in his wonderful, slim volume, Mój Lwów, My Lviv, first published in 1946 and last year published for the first time in English by the Pushkin Press with wonderful photographs by my dear friend Diana Matar, of which this is one, as the City of Lions. To be a Lwovian, Witlin wrote, is an extraordinary mixture of nobility and roguery, wisdom and imbecility, poetry and vulgarity. And he reminds his readers that nostalgia likes to falsify the flavors, telling us to taste nothing but the sweetness of Lvov today. But, Witlin writes, I know people for whom Lvov was a cup of gall. East-West Street was published 6 years later, in May 2016, by which time I had come to understand why Lviv was a cup of gall for my grandfather, a place of which he never spoke to me. By then, I'd also discovered, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, accidentally stumbled across, a set of remarkable points of coincidence and connection revolving around this city, which of course is also known to Germans as Lemberg and to Austrians as Lemberg, as Lwów to Poles, as Lvov to Russians, and as Leopolis to Italians. In preparing that lecture, back in 2010 in the summer, I learned that Raphael Lemkin, the man who invented the term genocide in 1944, was a student at the university and law faculty that had invited me to deliver a lecture. But those who invited me were unaware of that fact. Then I learned that Hirsch Lauterpacht, the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into international law in the summer of 1945, was also a student at that university and law faculty, although not at the same time. But those who invited me were again unaware of that fact. How remarkable, I thought back then, that you can trace the origins of the modern system of international criminal justice to the same city, the same university, the same classroom, and even the same teacher. And then a fourth man came into the story, Hans Frank, who arrived in Lviv in the summer of 1942 to announce the killing of tens, if not hundreds of thousands, of the city and region's Jewish and Polish residents, including the families, friends, and teachers of Leon, Lauterpacht, and Lemkin. Having served as Adolf Hitler's lawyer from 1928, Frank would then serve as Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, including the district of Galicia, of which Lemberg was the capital. In November 1945, he was in the dock at the famous Nuremberg trial, indicted both for genocide and crimes against humanity, and remarkably, he was prosecuted by Lauterpacht and Lemkin. When the trial began, they were not aware of his role in the fate of their families. By the end of the trial, they had learned of his role, but not the details. Those details would have to wait another 70 years to emerge. This was the story I found, researched, and wrote over 6 years with a great deal of assistance, including Ivan and other colleagues. It is obviously an intensely personal project. Readers of East-West Street will know of another strand, the one that explores the separate departures from Vienna, of Leon, of my grandmother Rita, and of my mother Ruth, who was only a year old when she was whisked to relative safety in 1939 by a person or persons unknown. It seems that the stories that I unearthed in Darkness and Light have resonated with a broader readership than I had ever imagined possible. It is a source of tremendous happiness that the book is published in Ukrainian and is in the process of being published now in more than 20 languages. This is both a source of happiness and inspiration, and it illustrates, I think, the open-ended nature of larger historical narratives which link big historical moments with deeply personal elements, the consequences of which are far-reaching, unintended, and continuing. What haunts, it seems, are not only the dead or the gaps left within us by the secrets of others, but also the stories of those who follow them. The publication of East-West Street in so many different languages tends, I think, to reinforce a sense that the stories that I happened to come across touch on themes of universal and global interest, matters that touch all of us, matters of identity, of family, of politics, of responsibility. What could possibly explain the level of interest? This is a question I've wondered about and settled on two distinct elements. The first is that the stories of individuals who acted in ways magnificent or dastardly resonate very widely, especially if the focus touches on apparently small points of detail. Such points of detail can, as I've come to understand in life generally, illuminate a larger truth. You learn that in the courtroom also. The second element is that the book's central intellectual points of focus, the question of identity, of one community's relationship with the other, is a matter of continuing and renewed relevance for many people in many parts of the world today. It is in vogue as a new wave of xenophobia and nationalism sweeps across Europe and the United States and other places. The arrival of East-West Street coincided with a particular moment in which it seems the experiences of the 1930s have come back with a vengeance. A few days after publication, Britain voted, sort of, for Brexit. And a few months later, the United States voted, sort of, for President Trump. I didn't expect the steady flow of communications, the daily letters, emails, and tweets that followed publication, more than 2,500 in the past year alone. Some ask very specific questions. What do you mean by the last sentence in your book? And a tiny few offer entertaining critique, such as, although I have very great respect for Lauterpacht and Lemkin, ... The great majority share a reminiscence or a recollection, often personal, and others have given me new information, sometimes of a rather captivating quality. I feel very privileged to have received each and every one of these communications, because to have a relationship with readers, particularly when you're an academic and you're not used to that, is a matter of real satisfaction. People have written to me, of course, about places. Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg. The city seems to inspire very powerful feelings in anyone who passes through it, and not only as a cup of gall. Perhaps the book touched me because I was born in Lvov in 1947, writes an American. In 1973, I served in the Soviet Army. Then in 1976, I emigrated to the USA and never went back to Lvov. Others who write describe a more direct connection with the times and the places in the book. A professor of pediatrics, with whom I've now spent considerable amounts of time in New York and London, writes without any rancor at all of his personal experience of the Lemberg ghetto, of Die Große Aktion of August 1942, when tens of thousands were murdered. I was able to walk all around the city of Lvov, wearing my white armband with the blue Star of David, he writes. And then he tells me that on the day of the events when my family were taken, which you describe, I went back to our apartment at number 2 Bonifratrov, which was in the Lichazau area of the city, very far from the original Jewish district, and the one where the prospective ghetto was being established. The Aktion, he writes, took place all over the city. A lady born in the military hospital in the city's same district in 1935 was recognized as the daughter of the 14th Regiment in which her father served. Now living in London, she sends extracts of her own very fine translation of the memoirs of Countess Dr. Karolina Lancharonska, who happened to teach art history at the University of Lvov. The Countess recalls being interrogated by SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Krüger, in the course of which he admits responsibility for the terrible massacre in this city in July 1941 of Lvov's professors and writers. They included Lauterpacht and Lemkin's teacher Roman Longchamp de Berrier, along with his 3 sons. He was the dean of the law school. Many years later, in 1967, that countess appears as a witness in the trial of Krüger in criminal proceedings in Germany, but not, she writes, for the Lvov killings. So I wrote to all the branches of the German judiciary asking that they hear my evidence again, this time in a trial for the Lvov crime. I received no reply. A medical doctor in America who lived through those events, also a pediatrician, writes that he remembers very well of the landmarks that I describe. He refers me to his book, Strangers in Many Lands, which recounts what he lived through. He explains, I was born in Katowice in 1935, but spent the war years and the immediate post-war period in Lviv and its vicinity. My parents managed to hide me in 1942 in the monasteries of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky. I arrived in England in 1946 and the US in 1949. I just pause to say I did not know this lecture was taking place in the Sheptytsky Center, so it's very remarkable that this was written without knowledge that we would be actually here. The city weaves a spell over even those who are not born there or haven't even visited. A retired judge living in Edinburgh, whom I have known and admired for many years, actually who was the British judge on the European Court of Justice for many years, writes totally out of the blue. Curiously, he says, I also have a Lvov connection. He explains that it dates back many decades to the time of the Second World War, when the largest contingent of Polish soldiers was stationed in Perth, which was his hometown. Those present included, he writes, the Polish Army Choir and the members of the Lvovska Fala, Lvov's Merry Wave, and a conductor whose name he recalls as Jerzy Kolachowski, who came from Lvov. They recorded several Scottish songs, these Poles, with HMV, a record company. But as most of the choir didn't understand a single word of English, the retired judge's father wrote out the words in a phonetic script of some sort. At book events around the world, from Montreal to Mexico City, from Los Angeles to Warsaw, from New York to Paris, I'm often approached by a descendant of the city's one-time inhabitants. There is, it seems, an amazing Lviv diaspora. Some are even very close by to where I teach, like the colleague from a different faculty at the University College London, my university, whose reputation, this colleague, I was aware of, but I'd never actually met him. A brother of the author of a particularly generous review in the Times writes of his forebears who shared the family name of my grandmother Rita of his own Landis connection. All I know was the Lvov Landis family had very strong Viennese connections, as a result of which my grandfather studied in and subsequently served in a Viennese regiment during the First World War, here around Lvov. He sends this photograph of great-grandfather Melek. And of course, I noticed instantly that Melek has exactly the same Habsburg jaw, as it is known, as my grandmother Rita. This causes me to wonder if we might be related, and with a little more digging, it seems that in fact we are. The son of a man born in Lvov in 1913 tells me that his father always talked about his land and his lost property, which included a house and several flats in central Lvov. Is there any chance, he asks, of a restitution of this property? Might I be in a position to help? Not long after, following a lecture I've given in Toronto, a smiling lady approaches me with outstretched arm, which offers a different kind of restitution, a small book with a grey cover. She says it's a family heirloom, a copy of the original 1946 edition of Joseph Vitlin's book Mój Lvów in Polish, something which I've been looking for years. A singular act of kindness. She tells me she'd like me to have this first edition of the book, having noticed that it has served as one of my first guides of the city. Another descendant of the city writes to let me know that he is the grandson of the man named in this piece of marble, Adolf Pillar, who happens to be the architect who built number 6 Teatralna Street, where Hirsch Lauterpacht lived as a student, and whose name is inscribed forever on the white marble in the hallway of the building. The grandson also tells me the fate of his father, the son of the man who designed the Lauterpacht family home in Lviv. Engineer Pilera was a member of the first ever transport to Auschwitz. On June the 14th, 1940, he was assigned prisoner number 350. Last September, I attended a BBC promenade concert at the Royal Albert Hall in London, a performance of Mozart's 14th piano concerto by a globally renowned pianist, a winner of 7 Grammys, no less. I had many of his records, but had never heard him perform live in a concert. I knew too that he was born in Lviv in 1949, and that made me curious. After the concert, I was invited to meet him, and I inquired quite gently whether he had ever returned to Lviv, a city he left in 1946. I had my first piano lessons in Lviv, he wrote, but he had never returned. Would you like to? I asked. Very much, he replied. And I'm so very delighted that he arrives in the city on Saturday and will perform with us at Lviv's Philharmonia Hall on Saturday evening. This will be the first time Emanuel Ax has ever performed in his city of birth. From Australia, an email arrives. It contains an extract from the biography of a man called James Elroy Flecker, the first sentence of which reads, James Elroy's paternal grandfather, Isaac Flecker, was a Jew from Lvov who became a schoolmaster in Constantinople. The writer of the email to me describes Elroy as a minor English poet and explains that he had turned to the Flecker biography as an inconsequential work that would help him to ease into sleep after reading East-West Street, having just learned all about Miss Tilney when it was time for bed. Regrettably, he adds in his email, the first sentence of the Flecker biography meant that sleep was no longer a consideration, as I was once again on another journey into Lviv. Miss Tilney's vocation prompts a significant number of inquiries. A journalist who writes after a book event at Shakespeare & Co. in Paris ends his email, and I think many people feel this sentiment, thank God for Miss Tilney. The sentiment is shared by a barrister colleague who writes to tell me that nothing beats the woman who saved your mum. I agree. And I could say the same for the first line of chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans, a line to which it seems I owe my very existence. Readers will be aware that Miss Tilney saved many others, including a man called Sasha Kravec, whose later life remained a mystery to me. I couldn't find out what happened to Sasha Kravec, but the answer comes in a letter from Dublin, a clue in the form of a transcript of a January 1946 interrogation in Nuremberg of a lady called Miss Hildegard Kunze, who happened to be the typist to a gentleman called Adolf Eichmann. Present at the interrogation, the transcript reports, apart from a court reporter and interpreter, was one Sasha Kravec. And I've wondered whether the two Kravecs are indeed the same. Descendants of Żółkiew, near to Lviv, where the Lauterpacht and Buchholz families came from, also reach out. One correspondent writes of her grandfather, born in 1881 in the vicinity of Żółkiew's East-West Street, and of her uncle, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who turns out to have been a mentor of one of my sources who I consulted for the book. Her grandfather suffered a terrible depression, she writes, whilst on a visit to London. He went into analysis with Hannah Siegel, the renowned psychoanalyst, who will later write a lengthy paper that deals entirely with his life in Żółkiew and his fears of impending death. Vienna too has its draws. An emeritus professor of physiology from Glasgow, who came to England from Vienna on the Kindertransport in 1939, couples a sad recollection of his parents' fate with happier memories of food and a man called Siegfried Rammler, who is the only surviving interpreter of the Nuremberg trial, whom I had the good fortune to meet and to interview. Siggy and I were playmates in Vienna, he writes. The Ramlers lived in a tenement near the bottom end of the road. Poor as they were, Siggy's mother always contrived to have home-made raisin wine and beautifully baked bread for the Sabbath. The director of an archive in Vienna writes out of the blue, Dear Philippe, you might not remember me. We met in Cambridge during a production of La Cage aux Folles, in what seems like a different life on a different planet. I was in Cambridge as a German language assistant, and you were in your second year, and we all went up to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival together. I respond with excitement to share with him yet another coincidence, namely that it was his archive's website that threw up the crucial clue that helped me to learn about my great-grandmother's final journeys. A British television director and producer of films writes, I'm reading your book, and last night I happened to read the final pages about the man in the bow tie, who is my grandmother's lover. When I read where he had lived in Vienna in 1941, I found myself almost shivering, for I was reading the book at number 4 Brahmsplatz, which is where the man in the bow tie happened to live. Readers of the book will be aware that it was in this garden next to number 4 Brahmsplatz that my grandmother was photographed in 1941. The television director continues, "The person whose flat I stayed in has lived there since 1938. Her father was an Austrian who held some position or other. She is not very forthcoming about it, and the family took over the flat of a very rich Jewish family. My hostess is on the one hand a bit embarrassed about it all. On the other hand, she bends over backwards to embrace all things Jewish, somehow hoping to make up for her father's actions and her own good fortune in having inherited the flat that he seized. I hope to visit the flat and that garden in December when I'm next in Vienna." There are 4 principal characters in my book, and each of them generates a heavy and generous correspondence. An envelope arrives at my barrister's chambers. It is scanned and sent on to me as I'm working abroad with a note. "You will want to see this." It's a gentle, handwritten letter from a lady in New York, a new relative who has emerged somewhat out of the blue. She writes, "I thought you might want to hear from someone like me who remembers your grandfather Leon fondly for his kindness, wisdom, and incisive gentleness." Suzanne explains that she was born in Vienna in 1932, that she is the daughter of my grandmother's brother Bernard, and that Leon was her uncle. This is the first time I have any connection with that family. From another side of the family in Tel Aviv, a niece of my grandfather, whose existence I only came to know of in writing this book, has been shown a copy of the pages in which she features. The son of Herta Gruber offers an account. I read to her from the beginning, but after a few lines she took the book and continued reading it, first loud, then quietly to herself. From time to time she stopped to wipe her tears. When finished, she gave back the book to me and swung her hand as if to wave away the memories. And then, perhaps even more remarkably, 10 days ago, I received a totally unexpected letter. It came from Henrik Flashner, who's here tonight, I'm very happy to say, a professor in Los Angeles. "Please forgive me," he writes, "for bothering you with this unexpected message. I've decided to write to you after starting to read your book East-West Street. I was surprised to find the name of my grandfather, Natan Flashner, mentioned in your book on page 23. Apparently he is the uncle of your grandfather, Leon. This means that my father, named also Henrik Flashner, like me, born in Żółkiew, Żowkwa, in 1910, is Leon's first cousin. I was delighted to find out that the Flashners were a big family. My father looked for relatives from his father's side of the family after the Holocaust, but could not find any. He looked for relatives for a long time and finally concluded that none of his father's relatives survived. He was wrong, but in this way I learned that my grandfather was not as alone as he believed he was for the rest of his life. It's fantastic that Henrik has come to Lvov for this weekend." A resident of Innsbruck in Austria, a stranger, is prompted to engage in research of his own. It's amazing how a book like this gets people to go off and do their own research. Others here, Norman Davis, I see in the front row, will have experienced exactly the same reaction. He uncovers a Viennese telephone directory dating to 1938. "I found your grandfather with the following main telephone number at page 73, row 4, he writes, and he sends the enclosed image. A historian from Nuremberg takes particular interest in the original German documents that I've produced, including the order expelling Leon from the Reich. A perfect example, he writes, of the blurred lines between party and state authorities in the Nazi regime. He may also have uncovered the sad fate of the mysterious Seelenarzt, the soul doctor Steiner, the man who wrote the letter in February 1939 that contained the clue as to the disharmony in my grandparents' marriage. He tells me he's located the death certificate for Leon Steiner from Vienna, issued in Theresienstadt in 1942. Herr Steiner's profession is marked as Privatier, an old-fashioned term, he tells me, for people who live from their private patrimony without dedicating themselves to daily work, which would leave plenty of time for being a soul doctor. Raphael Lemkin excites a huge amount of attention. One correspondent, a regular visitor to the Cincinnati Library in Ohio, is prompted by a passage in the book about Lemkin inscribing a copy of his book Axis Rule to Dr. Robert Kempner, a prosecutor at Nuremberg. I thought you might be interested to know of another copy, she writes, inscribed by Dr. Lemkin to our own late Senator Robert Taft. It's now, she says, in the rare books collection. It seems this copy was donated to the library by the Taft family, adding wistfully that the senator did not live long enough to see US ratification of the Genocide Convention. And then this letter comes, possibly one of my favorite. An 88-year-old lady, a very fine artist, judging by the copies of her own work that she encloses, writes from Los Angeles. She says she's been particularly interested in sections of the book that relate to Lemkin. And let me quote her in full. You see, he was my cousin. My mother's maiden name was Rachel Pomerantz, and she was Bella's sister, the mother of Raphael. I was very young when I met Raphael when he visited my family in Chicago a few times during his many travels. I didn't realize the full extent of his work or his struggles and hardships. I knew, however, what an incredible, kind and loving man he was. He would arrive at our simple third-floor apartment in Chicago, and he'd just knock on the door. No warning, and there he was. He would refuse always the comfort of one of our bedrooms, as he felt he would be intruding, and he always slept on our fairly worn couch. He loved my mother's great cooking, and when he was ready to leave, we packed his bag with delicious morsels for his long journey to I never knew where. Lauterpacht too is remembered. From Grantchester, the widow of the university professor who delivered the first lecture on international law I ever attended, writes, I knew Harsh Lauterpacht in his last years, when he and my husband had quite a close relationship. We knew of his appalling loss. He would never again set foot in Germany after the Nuremberg trials. But the dramatic links between his family, Lemkin's, and your own, as well as Hans Frank, add even more poignancy to the story. From Australia, a lady with a doctorate in Holocaust and exile studies tells me she's listened to my selection of musical choices on the Margaret Throsby radio show. She tells me that her father-in-law was interned in Lviv in 1939 and then disappeared. She then writes, and I quote, "Sir Hirsch saved my grandmother, my mother and her two sisters, who were desperate to leave Munich after my grandfather was interned in Dachau the day after Kristallnacht and died 2 weeks later. Hirsch came to their rescue by issuing an affidavit for my grandmother and her 3 daughters to come to England and work in domestic service. My mother and my grandmother were employed in Sir Hirsch's household. My mother vividly remembers their son Eli as a young boy." From Lviv, a friend sends a photograph of the new memorial opened in September 2016 on the site of the Golden Rose Synagogue. Granite slates record the words of former residents of the city. Among them stands one on which are now engraved, you can all go and see it for yourselves, the words spoken to me in Paris back in 2012 as we drank black tea by Hirsch Lauterpacht's niece Inka, first recorded in the book. I pass Inka's words onto the city, and they are now set in stone. My mother had been taken. I saw everything looking out of the window. I was 12. I wasn't a child anymore. I saw my father running after my mother behind me on the street. I understood it was over. I knew what was happening. I can still visualize the scene. My mother's dress, her high heels. Hans Frank, too, generates reactions. The day after a book event at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which I attended with Frank's son, Nicholas, who's donated certain family artifacts to the museum, a renowned current-day Nazi hunter who works for the United States Department of Justice writes to me, "As I was walking Nicholas back to his hotel, he exclaimed to me, 'If only my father could see this.' I replied," this is the Justice Department lawyer writing, "'If only my father could see this.' And we shared a good laugh. History certainly takes surprising paths," he adds. From further south of Washington, D.C., a man in Georgia writes to say that his father was a guard in courtroom 600 at the Nuremberg trial. Occasionally, he would speak to the family of his interactions with the accused, including Dr. Hans Frank. And he asked for his signature. He passes on 3 of his father's photographs. One is of Dr. Frank's autograph that my father collected. Other characters also attract interest. After speaking at a book fair at Charleston, the home of Virginia Woolf in Sussex, a lady stands first in line at the book signing, and she says, "Your book really interested me, touched me personally. I express interest and inquire further. Anything in particular? Actually," she says, "Hartley Shawcross was my father, and you really weren't very nice about him, were you?" She says that with a lovely smile. "Only reporting what others said," I managed to reply. And a few days ago, I received an email expressing gratitude for the book, all the more because you mentioned my late father-in-law, Israel Zangwill. I thought everyone in the world had forgotten about him. The next day comes another letter. I was terribly pleased to see the reference to my grandfather, R.W. Cooper, and his book on Nuremberg. He was the Times correspondent for the trial. In particular, I was interested to see your reference to him being a route for Lemkin to influence on recognition of the crime of genocide. The long arm not only of the law, it might be said, but also of family. The book's historical and political implications also inspire various reactions. Many school teachers in the UK and elsewhere write to me about the need to improve teaching of the matters addressed in the book. A professor of epidemiology and public health tells me he's intrigued by the challenges between crimes against humanity being about individuals and genocide about groups. He tells me that it matches precisely his work on and research on inequalities in health, which focuses on groups, socioeconomic, ethnic, gender, geographic. And clinicians now want to know, what about individuals? How do we deal with them? The challenge, this professor writes, is to show how public health and concern for individuals rather than groups should not be opposed. Others, in rather considerable numbers, actually huge numbers, write about parallels between the period that I write about in East-West Street and what's happening in the world today, especially in Britain and the United States. Although as the book is now published in other places, I'm starting to get letters from around the world. A 71-year-old social worker sees parallels in what I describe happening in the 30s in Poland and Germany, he writes, and what is happening in Palestine now. A New York-based editor who recently republished Lemkin's book Axis Rule, in which the word genocide appeared for the first time, writes to say that East-West Street appears to address an anxiety enveloping our times, and the fear that we may be heading for a turn somehow akin to the transformations of the interwar years. This is a very frequent theme. A Scotsman tells me that he is instinctively distrustful of nationalism of all sorts. And then he asks, now that we in Britain are faced with a resurgent right and live in a place where judges are called scum by neo-fascists and enemies of the people by a newspaper which sells massively, the Daily Mail, what should be done? Having voted for the Union in the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence, the book now prompts him to wonder whether he did the right thing. Do I, in any second Scottish independence referendum, vote for what appears to be the inclusive civic nationalism of the Yes campaign, rather than the continuation of the Union and the xenophobia which has now enveloped it? That question surely has a broad resonance. A retired British diplomat, very senior, with decades of personal high-level experience on matters European and international, writes in the very short period between the book's publication and the UK referendum on EU membership. It should be read by every voter before the 23rd of June, he writes, as a wake-up call about the fragility of the structures of peace and stability we have created over 70 years and the carelessness with which we seem prepared to disregard them. Disregard the structures of peace and stability we did by the narrow margin of 52% to 48%, although not in Scotland, not in Northern Ireland, and not in London. Was this just abject carelessness, and what will the consequences be? The personal stories in East-West Street offer a fragment of a larger picture, a world that came together in 1945 to establish new institutions and rules which would place constraints on the actions of governments, a world for the first time in which individuals and groups would have rights under international law, a world in which the power of the sovereign and of sovereignty itself would not be absolute anymore. The Nuremberg trial was part of a remarkable moment, one that led from the Charter of the United Nations to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, from the Refugee Convention to the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Economic Community. It was a moment premised on ideas about individual rights and economic integration, intended to create a new politics in which the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s would not be repeated. The world then created was surely imperfect, but it has generally helped Europe achieve a period of relative peace and prosperity. Today, it seems to me that world is under threat, with the risk of the 1945 settlement unraveling, but with no sense or vision as to what might actually replace it. Has there been a loss of collective historical memory, with calls in the United Kingdom to take back control, and in the United States to make America great again? Does taking back control, or wishing the possibility to make ourselves great again, mean the right to treat citizens and others as a state wishes, unconstrained by international laws and other commitments? Once again, as I mentioned, a poison of xenophobia and nationalism is coursing its way through the veins of Europe and many other parts of the world, including, most regrettably, the United States. I see this on my journeys to the central and eastern parts of our common European continent, to Hungary, to Poland, and also, of course, to here in the Ukraine. Those of you who've seen my BBC Storyville film, My Nazi Legacy, directed by David Evans, will have seen me at a particular moment standing in a faraway field not too far from Lviv, near the town of Brody, talking to people dressed in SS uniforms, celebrating the creation in 1943, not very far from where we are meeting here tonight, of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division by Governor Otto Wächter. I see the poison of xenophobia and nationalism in Britain, in some, but certainly not all, of the votes for Brexit and in related political developments. I see it in the views of a Prime Minister who just a year ago expressed the hope that she wanted the United Kingdom to be able to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. How shocking is that? And who felt able to tell her party conference just a year ago in October 2016 that if you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Her words reminded me of a passage in Stefan Zweig's magnificent book. If there is one book to read to make us understand where we are now, it is this book, The World of Yesterday, required reading for our times, published posthumously in 1942, just after Zweig had committed suicide. For almost half a century, he wrote, I trained my heart to beat as the heart of a citizen of the world. On the day I lost my Austrian passport, I discovered that when you lose your native land, you are losing more than a patch of territory set within borders. Do we see shades of Germany in the 1930s when a widely read British newspaper, the Daily Mail, runs a front page story with a picture of 3 senior judges who have been asked to interpret and apply English law and the constitutional requirements of Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, and which newspaper describes them, and I quote, as enemies of the people? Where, oh where are we heading? One former London mayor, Ken Livingstone, offensively evokes Adolf Hitler as somehow being a supporter of Zionism. Another suggests that the EU and Hitler somehow have common aims. Boris Johnson also has no compunction in the course of the Brexit referendum campaign in referring to President Barack Obama as part Kenyan to explain the US president's perceived anti-British tendency. Several years ago, in writing about Africa, Boris Johnson somehow felt able to refer to flag-waving pickaninnies in the Congo and to tribal warriors with watermelon smiles. That is the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary today. How terribly sad is that? Where, oh where are we heading? The United States elects Donald Trump as president. He rails against the media and fake news. More shades of Germany in the 1930s, one might ask. And one of his first acts is to sign an executive order which would, but for the actions of independent judges on federal courts, with immediate effect, ban entire categories of human beings, individuals and groups, from entering the United States simply because they happen to hold a particular nationality, to be the nationals of 7 countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. 2 years ago, Mr. Trump called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. The idea of targeting people, not because of their individual propensities, but because they happen to be a member of a particular group, has a long and dark history which this city knows all too well. The writer Primo Levi, who spent a year as a resident of Auschwitz, put the point very crisply in the preface to his book, If This Is a Man, published 70 years ago, exactly. He wrote, many people, many nations can find themselves holding more or less wittingly that every stranger is an enemy. When this happens, Levi continues, when the unspoken dogma becomes the major premise in a syllogism, then at the end of the chain there is the concentration camp. One thing leads to another. I was astonished to learn just yesterday from my wife, who is a magistrate, that magistrates in the United Kingdom have now been instructed at the beginning of a trial to ask defendants to declare their nationality. That is deeply troubling when we know about the history that I am describing. Experience teaches us to know where such a beginning can lead, singling out people not for what they might have done, but because they happen to be a member of a particular group. My family knows to where such a beginning can lead. Researching my book, I came across this document, the order that expelled my grandfather Leon, child of Lemberg, Lviv, from the German Reich in November 1938. Translated into English, it says, the Jew, Buchholz, Morris Leon, is required to leave the territory of the German Reich by December the 25th, 1938. My grandfather posed no threat to anyone. He could be expelled because he'd been made stateless, and he was then expelled just because of his religion. How ironic, 7 decades on, that the two countries that did more than any other to put in place the rules that prohibited actions of such a kind, creating rights under international law for individuals and for groups, have fallen off their perches. How ironic, 7 decades after the opening of the Nuremberg trial, with its British and American prosecutors and 22 German defendants, that many in Europe now look to Germany as the bastion of liberal democracy, as the protector of the rule of law, of the rights of refugees, of support for the European Convention on Human Rights, and for international rules more generally. So where are we heading? I worry somehow less about the United States, with its more robust constitution, having seen firsthand the forces of opposition that have come together to engage actively to protect basic rights. Mr. Trump may turn out to be a 4-year blip, or he may not. Brexit, on the other hand, if it actually happens, would not be a mere 4-year interlude. The consequences of the vote to leave are potentially, in my view, far greater in social, political, and economic terms, and possibly even existential for the United Kingdom. We're seeing the debate, we're seeing a country that is falling apart in its unpreparedness for what it is having to deal with. I find that immensely, immensely sad to see my country, I have 2 countries, also France, with a reputation so diminished, a global role so declined, and a sense of drift and dissolution so palpable. And what of Ukraine? I've been visiting this wonderful city and this country for 7 years. One of the first lectures I ever gave back in 2010 was here at this university, the Ukrainian Catholic University. I've come to know the streets and the buildings and the many very fine people. But for the assistance of some, as I said, who are here in this room this evening, the book would never have been what it was. The connections through the archives, for example, which led to the teachers, for the understanding of the buildings, would not have been clear. So I have feelings of deep gratitude and respect to each and every person who helped me on my travels. And I'm bound to say that being in Lviv today does feel quite a lot like being at home. But I'm conscious too of the difficulties and the challenges that are to be faced, not least those of an economic nature. Addressing issues from the past is also not easy. Lviv knows that, and it requires a fortitude and an independent spirit. Speaking truth to power is never easy. I'm aware of the many difficulties that many of you in this room face, of problems with the law, of problems with the courts, of problems with independent judges or not so independent judges. I'm aware of the endemic difficulties of corruption that seem to permeate every nook and cranny, and of the multitude of challenges faced by students and teachers. But I have to say, I'm also deeply encouraged by the new generation that's coming along. when I last was here just a few weeks ago for the launch of East-West Street in Ukrainian at the Lviv Book Fair, we had a side event on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. For such an event in London, you would get a few hardy souls, and they would all be middle-aged like me or even older. But on a Sunday morning, what a joy it was to enter a space that was absolutely packed, totally packed, with young people, under 25 they looked to me, hungry for information and ideas, hungry to talk, hungry to debate, hungry to discuss. And that, it seems to me, is the positive side of what's happening in Lviv and in the Ukraine. As the overt use of racial and identity politics returns to center stage, the experience of writing East-West Street, with its immersion in the world of the years between 1914 and 1945, makes it, I have to confess, difficult not to feel an acute sense of anxiety about what is stirring. I continue to oscillate between the views of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, between the realism of Lemkin and the idealism of Lauterpacht. I can see the force of both arguments and recognize the tension and the struggle between the individual and the group, between crimes against humanity and genocide. It's a tension which will not soon be resolved, which will certainly not disappear as international law continues to offer the hope of a collective embrace of both ideas. In the meantime, as I embark on a sequel of East-West Street, tracing a story of escape after the war of another character in the book, Otto von Wächter, whose name will be familiar to you, deputy to Hans Frank, indicted as former governor of Krakow and governor of Galicia, resident in this city for 3 years for international crimes, who makes his way to the Vatican en route for Argentina, only to get caught up in a world of Cold War espionage and double-dealing. Against that background, somehow, for I am always the optimist, I managed to find grounds for optimism. Experience teaches that the ideas of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, with their remarkable sense of humanity and hope, and with their endearing attachment to the possibility of international rules, the possibility of international justice, will not soon appear. How remarkable that in 2017, the city of Lviv should now choose to embrace its two remarkable sons. How fantastic that the mayor of this city should choose this moment to recognize and to honor them. On Saturday, they will be honored for the first time with a weekend of festivities, memorials being placed on the walls of the buildings that were once their homes at number 6 Teatralna Street for Hirsch Lauterpacht and at number 21 Zamashtinivska Street for Raphael Lemkin, and at another address for Louis Sohn. And how pleased I am that Peter Trubov is here today to honor another famous and wonderful international law son of this city. And we will have on the Saturday night, as I already mentioned, a concert at the Philharmonic Hall. What an amazing thing, going against the current, to honor these people from different communities as children of this city. For this to have happened, and for my being able to stand before you, that is due to another child of this city, and that's my grandfather Leon. He left here in 1914, just as the Russians were about to take control of the city. A century later, here we all are, sort of wondering where we're heading to next, as Ukraine finds itself a century later facing a not so different struggle from the one that occurred in 1914. There are many uncertainties, to be sure, but there are also things of which we can be more certain. That our lives are made better with a rule of law, that Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and through them this city, made a difference, that we share common values, and that the power of memory and imagination and their shadows and their consequences are not easily cast aside. My sense is that the legacy of 1945 remains and that it will not easily be undone. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Philip. Now it's time to move to the stage of Q&A session, and if you have questions, you may ask. Only few, yes. Who want to be the first? Okay.
Thank you so much for this. I'm so grateful for the book that I'm actually reading this weekend, but I just thought to kind of make, just to throw out to the stage something that's very obvious. Today is November 9th, the Kristallnacht, and an important date for Germany on so many other levels as well, and also for your family. So from your book, I think your mother was sent away on the 9th, so on the Kristallnacht. I just remember kind of browsing through that, but just thought that's an important, I mean, it's not a coincidence that we're meeting here today, I'd like to think.
I must say, there are so many dates that one could remember. I hadn't made that point of connection that today is the 9th of November and that it was, 79 years ago. I've just actually been reading the diaries of Otto Wächter for the week of the 6th, 7th of November 1938, when he was newly installed as the State Commissioner for Personnel, which basically meant removing certain people from public office. And on the evening of Kristallnacht, his wife went to the opera in Vienna, and she then got extremely irritated with him because he was in a bad mood. But the diary doesn't explain why. So these points of detail continue to occupy me in different ways. Actually, on the 9th of November 1938, my mother would have still been in Vienna. Her father left a couple of months later. He was expelled at the end of November. He left in January 1939. But he left behind, I'm not going to spoil it all for you, his wife and his daughter. And that became one of the mysteries that I needed to resolve and find out what had happened. And I did, I think, manage to resolve it in ways that were surprising and unexpected. And then what happened to her was that she was taken by an unknown person who I now know to be the remarkable Miss Tilney, who may be the greatest character in the book. And she was taken to Paris, and she lived with her father there until June 1940, when the Germans invaded France, and she was then sent to southern Paris, to a small town called Meudon, where she was hidden until August 1944, when she was 6 and a bit years old. And she says she has absolutely no memory of the first 6 years of her life. And life sort of began, in the memory sense, after that period.
Any other questions? You may ask also in Ukrainian. Ви також можете запитати українською.
Philippe, you spoke quite eloquently about the concerns in Western Europe and Eastern Europe and North America, and how that, to a certain extent, echoes many of the themes that were in your book. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the fact that there are crimes against humanity and arguably genocide as well occurring in Syria, in North Korea, in Myanmar. How do you view the legacy of these international lawyers that develop these concepts that have echoed over the generations? When we look around the world and we see not just the Trumpism and the Brexit, but we see the very crimes that those men fled from, that their families faced, and that are now occurring in various parts of the world.
Thank you, Sean, for directing me in that direction. I'm very grateful. It's a really important question and a really important point. I'm just going to slightly embarrass you by, since you didn't identify yourself, saying that this is the question comes from a gentleman called Sean Murphy, who is an American academic and who I've known for many years, and who happens to be the lead person responsible for drafting a United Nations International Law Commission convention on crimes against humanity, which does not exist at this point outside of the statute of the International Criminal Court. We look around the world and we see the things that are going on. Some of them are in my in-books. I'm very actively involved right now on what's happening to the Yazidi community, for example, in northern Iraq, and their desire to find some sort of justice for the horrors that happened to them. And it's tough particularly when you're a university teacher and you have in your classroom a group of incredibly smart, motivated students from a range of different backgrounds who are studying international law and studying these things and looking for signs of hope as they look around the world and see precisely the things that you are talking about. Contrary to the views and hopes of Robert Jackson, who opened the Nuremberg trial on the 20th of November 1945 with a speech which included the hope that it would never happen again. It has happened again, not in the same way, different horrors, but the horrors have continued, and international trials have not stopped it. International conventions have not stopped it. International courts being created has not stopped it. And so how do I deal with that reality? I deal with it in two ways. Firstly, I try to take refuge in the sense that one important difference between then and now was that back then there wasn't even a piece of paper which said you are not entitled to kill people in large numbers as individuals or members of a group. And that in political terms, in psychological terms, in cultural terms, the fact that bits of paper exist which give us some sort of a standard for saying this cannot be done, it is wrong, it is contrary to the law, is a step forward. But it doesn't stop the horrors. We all have to accept that. Which brings me then to my second point of refuge. I used to teach at Cambridge, and I had a wonderful colleague who you may remember, John Baker, now Sir John Baker, who was the professor of English legal history. And he and I would often talk about the things that I was doing in international law and the things he was doing in English legal history. And I would come up with an episode that I was engaged with, and he'd say, yes, Philippe. Yes. We dealt with that in England in about 1472. It took 425 years, he was, something like that, to sort out that particular problem. And I think the right way to think about the project that we are engaged in, the International Law Project, is that it's a long game. What happened in 1945 was a revolution. Sovereignty ceased in legal terms under international law to be absolute. Limits were placed on what states could do. And I don't think you can expect millennia of human practice, belief, activity to be transformed by a single moment and a single set of acts. And so the project that was unleashed and the ideas of men and women like Lauterpacht and Lemkin in 1945 is a very, very long game. And it's not one that's going to be sorted out in my lifetime or the lifetime of my children or my children's children. I think we have to look much further ahead. Against that, I think we also have to be realistic about something else, and I touch on it in the book, but don't really explore it very actively, and that is the unintended consequences of good intentions cast into writing and legal text. I do think that one of the consequences of the crystallization of the idea of genocide in international law, the protection of groups, and the crime of intentionally maiming, harming, destroying communities with the aim of destroying a group in whole or in part, has tended to reinforce the sense of group identity. I've seen it for myself in cases that I've done on genocide, where the psychological element of proving the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part, which you don't need when you're dealing with crimes against humanity, you know that better than anyone, has an effect that is observable when you are in a room with a legal advisor or a foreign minister to a country who has taken you through some grotesque video showing some horror having taken place, and you say to that person, actually, this doesn't prove genocide under international law. And the reaction, it's a psychological reaction, is to intensify the sense of hatred towards the perpetrator group and to intensify the sense of kinship with the victim group. And genocide, unintentionally, I think, has done that, which is why I think the balancing of your exercise in crimes against humanity is so important. Lauterpacht believed that every human being was entitled to protection because they were a human being. And that inherent quality of being a living, sentient human being meant that international law had to protect them. And he worried always that the concept of genocide, which has come to the fore as, quote, the crime of crimes, unquote, would have harmful consequences. And I think that too we have to reflect about. But your question is a huge question, and I have not done it justice, but I'm very grateful to you for raising it.
Thank you so much, Philip. Maybe the last one question, please, very laconic.
Thank you, Professor, for your brilliant speech. My question is on Holodomor. Can you please comment on problems of recognition of Holodomor as genocide? And also I would like to raise a question that genocide is limited only to ethnic groups. But what about social groups? For example, kulaks in the Soviet Union, which were killed, but it's not recognized as genocide because they are not an ethnic group. Is that reasonable and grounded? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, which raises issues of time and also of definition. So the concept of genocide was only invented in 1944 and only became part of international law in 1945, 46, or certainly by December 1946. And so there is a question of how to characterize the Holodomor, the mass killings in the territory that is now the Ukraine, or the Armenians in relation to the Ottoman Empire. And most governments will say, well, the concept of genocide didn't exist at that time in international law, therefore that cannot have been a genocide. For Lemkin, if you go through his research notes, he had no doubt, in fact he was very inspired by the Armenian killings, and he described that as a genocide, and he also described the Holodomor as a genocide. And for that reason, last year, one of Lemkin's books, well, the main book, was banned in Russia because he had characterized on his definition of genocide what happened as fulfilling the criteria for genocide. And so you have that temporal issue, which I think raises a lot of problems. No one disputes that a large number of people died on the territory of what is now the Ukraine in the 1930s, or that a large number of Armenians, massive number of Armenians, were killed by the Ottomans. The word is what causes, respectively, the governments of Turkey and the government of Russia to get very agitated. And that has always intrigued me. What is it about the magic of the word that Lemkin invented? But the other aspect that you raise, so to be very clear, Lemkin treated that. For him, that was a genocide. But so was the treatment by Germany and Britain and France of its colonies in the 19th century. And his filing cards are very interesting. He lists hundreds and hundreds of examples. He set the threshold much lower than international law, and his definition was also different from the final definition that was adopted in the convention. It included, for example, attacks on cultural objects. To destroy the culture of a community was to destroy the community. And the issue of definitions, you know, what is a race, what is a religion, what is a nationality, these are, particularly for non-lawyers, lawyers tend to take very simplistic categorizations in their legal definitions, but if you speak to philosophers, political scientists and historians, we come to understand when we step outside the narrow world of law that these terms are remarkably complex, contested, challenging. And of course, in Lviv, we understand that. I mean, again, coming back to the unveiling of plaques on Saturday, are Lauterpacht and Lemkin truly children of Lviv? I think they are. But of course, they're not, quote unquote, Ukrainian in modern terms. So how does a city like Lviv deal with them? Those were all issues that Lemkin was very focused on, and he defined genocide much more broadly. What has happened since the convention was adopted in 1948, and the convention was adopted precisely to protect countries like the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain and France from being lumbered with claims that they had been involved in genocidal activity, either by narrowing the definition or setting a limit in time, had to be after a certain date. But what countries are now doing in their domestic law is they are redefining genocide in different ways. And countries are now tending at the national level to expand the definition of genocide. So, for example, last year, Brazil became the first country to define under its domestic law genocide as including the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part for reasons of sexual orientation. And that is consistent with what's happening in other parts of the world, in the sense that you have a legal definition and you have a non-legal definition. Popular consciousness about what constitutes a genocide is very different from the legal definition. And then within the legal definition, you have the International Convention definition, and then you have now a myriad of national definitions going off in different directions. The simple answer is that both in time and scope, the definition of genocide is deeply contested, and it's deeply contested essentially for political reasons. How you define it has very significant implications for not only the scope of its application in time and in place, but also for the possibility of legal proceedings today, tomorrow, and in the future. So the lawyers and the governments, I think, are very concerned at the international level to keep the definition as narrow and as tight as possible so that you have very few cases. I'll close by illustrating the absurdity of the situation that exists today. Around the world, there is a date, 27th of January, which is recognized as International Holocaust Memorial Day. And in England, that date is recognized, and there's an organization that acts to decide what to do on Holocaust Memorial Day, and there's an advisory academic council, and I went to a couple of meetings of it, and I was told that they not only commemorate and memorialize the killings of the Jews and other people in the Holocaust, Poles, Roma, in the period 1933 to 1945, but they also commemorate and memorialize other acts of horror. And so I asked rather innocently, how do you decide which acts of horror you're going to mention? You know, there's so many, as Sean Murphy mentioned. So they said, we have a formula. The Foreign Office has given us a formula. And the formula has two elements. It must have happened after 1945, very convenient politically because it allows the thing you talked about and the Armenians to be pushed to one side. And there must be a judgment of an international court characterizing the act of horror as a genocide. So I said, okay, let me see if I've understood correctly. Applying that criteria, what that means is you will memorialize, commemorate, mark the killing of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men in Srebrenica, but you will say nothing about the killing of 3 million Congolese between 1998 and 2003. Is that correct? And they said, absolutely, you've understood. So I just said, well, what is the social utility of that? Why is that a useful thing to do? Doesn't that say we care more about 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men than 3 million Congolese? And there was a sort of pause in the room. And you could see that as an organization, they've got to keep a lid on what they're going to memorialize, and it's about being practical and not getting swept up by all of the horrors in the world. But it, I think, perfectly illustrates the absurdities of the definitions that are taken both in a legal context and in a political context. Definition and application is everything.
Thank you, Philip, and by this we will end our lecture, but still there is a chance, I think, we've spoken to Philip because a lot of people want to take your autograph. So we'll have a couple of minutes to take autographs here, and if you want to buy a book, it's in Ukrainian, of course, not in English. It's before the entrance to this room. І ще коротко в двох словах, тобто, що зараз буде величка автограф-сесія, і також у нас був розіграш книжки серед зареєстрованих учасників переміг Йосип Матла, я бачу, що він є. То ви можете підійти і отримати книжку з підписом автора. І також, хто ще хоче придбати книжку, підписати в автора, то є книжки, продаються перед входом в зал. Дякуємо вам і очікуємо вас на наших наступних заходах. And one more thing concerning the conference participants, please gather in 10-15 minutes in the hall on the first floor. Thank you. Дякую і до зустрічі.